Welcome to Arash's world, where you will hear prominent voices, psychoanalysts, psychologists, therapists, philosophers, and thought leaders talk about a variety of mental health concerns and problems, including how to deal with anxiety, depression, and chronic conditions, and how to become more resilient, find inner peace, be emotionally engaged in your personal and professional life, and just be your beautiful, authentic self. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Arash's world. We have a very special guest today. We have Ellis Scott. How are you doing?
I'm very well. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So the first question is the toughest, and then it's going to get easier as we go along. How would you briefly describe yourself? What would you say here to our audience in any way you see fit?
Well, I'm a debut novelist at 62. I started writing at only at 55 when I took early retirement because of illness. So I've published 9 short stories in literary journals, and 2 years ago I decided to write my first novel, and I submitted it to Dundurn Press in Canada in late 2024, and I was offered a publishing contract. So that's how I got here to be a writer, and that's why my first novel is coming out at such an age.
Yeah, no, I did not know that. That's awesome. And in this short time, you were also nominated for a Pushcart Prize
I was my
2020. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
my first story. Yeah,
Wow.
I took to writing. I wanted a creative outlet again. I was a filmmaker when I was young, and I gave it up and concentrated on my career, which was delivering humanitarian assistance, mostly in conflict zones. So I worked internationally for most of my life. And when I retired, I wanted another creative outlet. But I travel full time. I live on the road full time. So I couldn't be an abstract painter, for example. It wouldn't have fit in my bag. So I've been a lover of literary fiction all my life. And yeah, I took to it very quickly.
Yeah, so that's what I was wondering. You were a reader all your life, and now it's kind of coming together. You're on the other side of writing. And I find like usually the first like a debut novel or film is usually like very personal. It tends to be personal. It tends to be something that's really close to your heart, where you're not here driven. You haven't been tarnished by success and fame and so on. It's just like your entry and Night Terminus. So what would you tell us about it?
It's true. Just as a summary, Night Terminus is a novel about the AIDS crisis, and specifically what happens to the survivors. I think, like most writers, I wasn't really interested. I was interested less in the crisis itself than the aftermath. I was more interested in what came after, and the stories of the fallout. And I am a survivor of the AIDS crisis myself. I was an out teenager when it was first discovered, so I was very young. And so yes, it's a very personal story. It's fiction. All the characters are fiction, but of course they're amalgams of people that I've known or stories that I've heard through the decades. And I was specifically drawn then to writing about the survivors. So these are people who watched their friends and lovers die of AIDS, and who were supposed to die themselves, but for some reason didn't. And then, have had to survive and have had to live with the burden of survivor's guilt. And if they're HIV positives themselves, they've had to deal with a lifetime of physical ailments and the emotional scars and the PTSD of the AIDS crisis. And so I found there was a lot of meat there to write about. And surprisingly, I found that really there have been no novels written about the survivors of the AIDS crisis. There have been only a handful of novels about the AIDS crisis period for the last 10 or 15 years. It's kind of fallen off the radar. And so for this novel, I wanted to focus on them and their stories. It also occurred to me, as a witness to the AIDS crisis, as I said, I was a teenager. I was very young when it happened, and it was, as you can imagine, incredibly overwhelming. And I realized that I'm 62 now, so most of the survivors of the AIDS crisis are much older than me. And I realized that if we don't tell these stories now, there won't be any surviving witnesses left. All of us, will be dead in a relatively short amount of time. And so, very much like other survivors of crises, of witnesses, soldiers in World War I or what have you, I wanted to make sure that that the witnesses got to tell some of their story through this novel.
Hmm. Thank you for doing this. I mean, I think that takes a lot of courage, and I just love people who are open to that. And also, like, I find it very interesting because you're going through like the 4 decades, and it starts off. Your novel starts in 1985, and then as like the experience of it, and just looking also at that time, just simply like coming out as gay is already stressful on its own, and then you have this horrible epidemic that went on. So, if we broke it up into parts, what would we say was the beginning like? So 1985, as your novel starts. What is some of the things that you're looking at, you're talking about here in your novel?
In the first chapter, yes, the novel spans 40 years. It's 5 chapters that take place from 1985 to present day, 2025. And they all look at a different kind of part of the crisis.
Hmm.
And the first chapter begins with the narrator, who is also a teenager. The novel itself started with just a series of images that I had in my mind. And one of the images was from this chapter, and it was of a young man having a one night stand with somebody he meets at a train station, who's carrying a lot of secrets. And it turns out that he is a fugitive on the run from his home country because he has just committed a mercy killing of his partner.
Okay.
And he is very young. He's in his early 20s, and he was completely alone, and he had no support. The hospitals denied him access, and he didn't know what to do. So so that image kind of created the first chapter, and that's where we are in 1985. We're in really a state of emergency. Um, I know that for a lot of certainly younger generations, the AIDS crisis is ancient history, and I understand it was a long time ago. I remember when I was a kid in the late 70s, and people talked about the Second World War, and for me, it was the same. It was ancient history. Um, but I did want to start it off in that period of time because there were people like that who were already survivors, who were dealing with the emergency of the early days where clinicians were calling for a moratorium on care. People did not know how it was transmitted. Homosexuality was not discussed. Sex was not discussed. There was a huge mark of stigma. People were calling for people with AIDS to be tattooed and quarantined, and there was a lot of violence against people who were perceived to perhaps have AIDS. And we were really all alone as a community. We had to rely on ourselves, and it was a very, very difficult time. And so the narrator, in certain respects, reflects me because I was the same age at that time. In 1985, I was 20, and so yeah, that's where we start, and as I said, we finish in 2025.
Hmm. So as it was starting, I mean, there was a lot of confusion and in the world, and I think the closest we can talk about the pandemic, which was again like what is going on. Except here, it was like homosexuals were ostracized because of that, and they assumed it only affects them. And then we realized like no, we're all in this together. The same way with the pandemic, where it started off like in a place. Oh yeah, it's over there. It has nothing to do with us in China, and then everyone is suffering the consequences. So we see how things are really interlinked together. But the fear creates a lot of stigma, as you say, misconceptions. And over time, would you say that these misconceptions have changed, have altered? And what are some of the ones that we probably still have to this day? in terms of, again, misconceptions about AIDS itself.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the first part of your question, I'm with Fran Lebowitz on this. She was asked once about the connection between COVID and AIDS, and she shut down the question and said AIDS was nothing like COVID. Absolutely nothing. I kind of agree. I do understand. Obviously they are both pandemics, but the societal and governmental response to both were night and day for sure. And so, but absolutely, they were both. They were both pandemics, and there was a lot of fear at the beginning. I think it's a 180 in terms of the society and the times we live in now. I know my community is still under attack or is under attack again, but in the early 1980s, I mean, I think it's fair to say that not a lot of people knew a homosexual, a gay person. It was never discussed in the media unless to vilify us or make us the butt of jokes. There were no movies about us. There was no TV presence. There was obviously no internet, so there was no information dissemination. And we really lived in a shadow society at that point with no rights. We had no work rights, pension rights. We had no human rights. We had no marriage rights, and we had no adoption rights. And so when it hit our community, I think the general social response was good riddance. I mean, the jubilation was almost palpable. And violence was endemic. We were under a constant threat of assault. Religious groups were praying for our extinction. The government's response was complete silence. Ronald Reagan, who was the U.S. president since 1980, and AIDS was first discovered in 1981, didn't say the word AIDS until 1987. So 6 years passed before the highest elected official in the United States actually said the word. It's been almost half a century, and 44 million people have died of AIDS, and there's still no vaccine. And we had a COVID vaccine within 11 months. So there was no refusal of patients in the hospital. There wasn't, governments locked down very quickly in the West. Information was available for people in terms of, how you get COVID and how to protect yourself. It was all done very, very quickly, and the worst was over, I'd say, in about 18 months. And so, for us, it was 15 years of watching our friends and lovers die. And the real breakthrough, I think, that there were a lot of social breakthroughs. I think that the celebrities and eventually the media came around and started to show people with AIDS in a more positive light and a more sympathetic light. In our community, we also, after the initial shock and trauma of the first few years, we got very angry, and we decided, because nobody was going to come to our aid, that we were, going to do things ourselves. So we started our own hospices, our own information lines, our own support services, our own advocacy services, and of course, started direct action groups like ACT UP, which, were kind of changed the face of direct action and protest. And then in the mid 1990s, 1995, 1996, everything changed because they found medication that was able to suppress the AIDS virus, suppress HIV transmission. And so all of a sudden people, and this is why there are people in my book who didn't die, is all of a sudden, including myself, we were supposed to die, and then there was medication that kept us alive, and that almost guaranteed a fairly average life expectancy. And so that was a huge change. And alongside that, there was a new generation that came up that just didn't think sexual orientation was a big deal. I think about, I just watched Heated Rivalry, like everybody else. And I have to pinch myself when I watch things like that, because, we went from having absolutely no media presence whatsoever to programs like that are just, it's a bit of a miracle, and I just love the younger generation that just shrugs their shoulders and says, it makes no difference. It's a complete 180 from when I was a kid.
Yeah, for me it was Angels in America, seeing the series that really like woke me up to it. And that was in 2003, right? So and
Mhm.
it was like I realized like how much suffering there's involved, and you hear things in the news, but then like actually like perceiving it in a fictionalized form, but still then it becomes clearer like just the pain and suffering that is associated with it. And then we had also Philadelphia with Tom Hanks, which that was the 1993 written down. So, I mean, so would you say that the intent was good? It was noble to go in that direction of creating some sort of knowledge for others and also empathy for this condition, or would you say like it was too slow, way too slow, and way too sanitized in a way?
Well, I mean, those plays and films that you mentioned are seminal and very, very important to the fight, to the struggle. But I'll just remind everybody that Philadelphia came out in 1993, but AIDS was discovered in 1981. So there was a period of 12 years that were incredibly difficult. I lost all of my friends. I buried 3 lovers. And I had to start again in the 1990s. I had to create a whole new, with the exception of one person who's still alive, I had to create a whole new friendship network.
Mhm.
And as I said, I was a teenager when it started. And so, alongside all of the homophobia, institutionalized homophobia, and my personal struggles with trying to figure out who I was, at the same time, I was dropped into an epidemic that took pretty much everybody that I knew. And I also didn't have any elders to light my way because they were all dead
Mm.
in that decade.
Yeah.
So yes, but absolutely not taking away from, and there's from those films and plays, and there's lots of others. There's so many great documentaries about the crisis. I think about one that I saw not too long ago called "We Were Here," which is a wonderful documentary. And there's a great film. There's been so many great films about the HIV and AIDS crisis, and so I'm very very proud and very pleased for those. But going back to books, it's been very interesting as we opened. In the last 10 or 15 years, there hasn't really been that many books written about AIDS. I don't know why. I can probably guess. I have a few, I have a few hunches, but I think there's still a stigma around HIV because it's sexually transmitted for the most part, often sexually transmitted. And I think there's still, perhaps amongst older generations, there's still a stigma around gay sex, around anal sex, and around how it was originally transmitted. Of course, that did not remain the case for most of the crisis. But it also just fell off the radar. I don't know why, but hopefully this book and others that I'm sure will be written in the next few years will try to address that, because it was one of the most serious health crises of the 20th century.
Mhm. Yes, yes, absolutely. And I was wondering about the characters itself. Your narrator does not have a name.
Hmm.
And is that too? Well, why
Yeah,
why did you make that choice?
I think I wanted the narrator to be discovered by the reader through the other characters.
Mhm.
I think there have been a few other novels that have inspired me that have used that same device.
Mhm.
And I thought, especially because this narrator was young at the beginning and survives that 40 years and is still meeting people who are survivors, I thought it was an interesting way to look at it. And so so Night Terminus is not really his story. only. We certainly get to know him as the decades go by. But I wanted to keep his anonymity in terms of his name, because each chapter is named after one of the main five characters in the novel. And so I think from what I've heard from my feedback, you do get a very good sense of the narrator by the end. But yeah, it was a conscious device that I decided to use.
And the cast of characters, there are exiles, fugitives, rebels, artists. Sounds like a party. Like sounds like really cool people.
It's a party I think it was a party. I think they are, I think one of the themes that we discuss in the novel is statelessness and in turn belonging. I think queer people, are always the guests at the party. We don't have a homeland. In many ways, we're a diaspora, which is, I think, why we travel so often. But our rights or our lack of rights are always at the whim of other people, at the whim of straight society, at the whim of a Supreme Court that, by and large are often straight. And so being guests and never hosts, I think changes your perception of belonging and whether you feel like you belong or not. And I personally, as a gay person, have never fully felt that sense of belonging. And so I think a lot of queer people struggle with that. And it's not that I'm asking for a homeland, for a statehood, as it were, but Virginia Woolf, I think in her essay Three Guineas, talked about this in terms of women as well. She said, as a woman, I have no country. As a woman, I want no country. But she wrote that as Europe was militarizing at the beginning of the 20th century. And it's really more of a lament, that we don't have a place to call our own home. And so as we travel and as we are outlaws and as we are fugitives from that sense of belonging, what does that do to our psyche and what does it do to our relationships? And so, yes, the cast of characters in this novel are outsiders and outlaws, fugitives, sometimes from the law, sometimes just from their own feelings. They are reformed Buddhist monks. They are left-wing Catholics. There's a whole cast, but what they share is that sense of transience. And I think it's obviously a very strong theme in the novel. And the novel spans 3 continents. It jumps from Canada to Western Europe, to the UK, to Eastern Turkey, to Iran, and to India. So
yeah, and I was going to ask you about that. All these places, the Iranian desert too. Why these different places? Is that again, like you were saying, because you're kind of always on the go or trying to find a place or trying to find a home, or what was the impetus for all these different locations as well?
yes, I think so. I think coming out of the AIDS crisis, I think a lot of people were searching for that feeling of home, but at the same time, they also wanted to see the world. Many of them were sick, and so there was a lot of everything. There was a lot of bucket list travel, but there was a lot of people who decided to just pack up and move elsewhere and have those very important experiences that we all have in life when we travel. And so travel is very much a motif in the novel and is very, very important. And when you speak of the Iranian desert, there is chapter 2 involves a very big sojourn by the narrator and his best friend who is dying, who has received a diagnosis, and decides to sell his insurance policy for an amount of money so that they can do kind of a final trip. And that his best friend knows that he's not going to come back from this trip. So they end up in Western Europe, what was then Western Europe in 1989, West Berlin. And they decide to continue eastward into Turkey, and then eventually through the people that they meet in across the Iranian border and into the desert, where they have a final adventure.
Oh, okay. As I mean, the parts of this I can relate to being a global nomad and not really having a place and land. But again, it's really minor, much minor in comparison, right? So I that part I can understand. Again, much more magnified is what you and your diaspora was going through, and to an extent is going through today as well. But I want to like, I mean, you talked already about the pain, the suffering, the grief. I want to look at the aspect of survival and determination and resilience to be able to finish on a positive note and such a tragic event. So what would you say is that? Like, is there like maybe a closer knit community where you support each other more than it would be normally? Do you think there are also some certain beneficial effects? Again, this is a horrible thing, but there's always another side to when we go through suffering, when it creates these like tighter connections with others.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's what the novel is about, these connections, and what I think has resonated with people. Bad things happen to people, to good people all the time, of course. It's it's the courage and the resilience that you show in the face of that catastrophe. That's the meaning of life. That's your purpose, and that's what this novel is about. Absolutely. I mean, you can't choose when you were born and the era that you go through, but I have no regrets. I've known and met the most incredible people through the AIDS crisis. I've had the most incredible life personally. I think there's an old saying, I don't get this right, but if other people dictate the beginning of your story, can you still write the ending yourself? And I think that's how I've tried to live my entire life since the early 80s. And I think it's true. I think you can. And I think embracing that outlaw's body and embracing that resilience, you can write the end of your story. And that's been incredibly important to me. It's how I've lived my life.
Thank you again for this. And the story is Night Terminus, your debut novel. Best of luck to you with that. And thank you for being on Arash's World, Ellis Scott.
Thank you so much for having me.